Hi everybody and welcome to lesson 2. So today what we're going to look at is we're going to look at two particular parts. We're going to look at writing the background, which comes straight after your rationale, and then writing about the evidence. So two key parts to cover today. So let's have a look at your learning intentions. Students will be able to use their research question and supporting evidence to research and write the background and evidence parts of their report. To be successful, I have written the background section so that the reader has the required knowledge to understand the research question, and the evidence section so that the reader understands how the evidence links to the research question. So two key parts in there I want you to have a quick look at here. The purpose of the background section is so that the reader has the required knowledge to understand the research question. And the point of the evidence section is so that the reader understands the evidence and how it links to the research question. So understands how the evidence links to the research question. So two key purposes. Now we're going to have a look at a few different things. First off, we're going to look at for each one of them, we're going to look at two samples, if that's the way I can put it. One is a complete sample that has been provided, and this sample is going to be written at a very high level. And then the other one is the really simplified version that we talked about last video with the lolly sample. So we'll have a look at the high sample, or the example first that we're given of a research investigation. So this one's written, and this one we're going to build as we go. I might just cover that one up so that we can focus on one at a time. Okay, so the sample that we have that I'm going to read to you today, it has a claim, and the claim is that human evolution is still occurring. It's very broad, it's very open-ended, and we went through how to go from the claim to a research question in the last video. So their claim is human evolution is still occurring, and their research question is the prevalence of lactose intolerance in Finland linked to the practice of domesticating cattle for dairy purposes? So you can see that the claim, super open-ended, and the research question, very, very targeted. We're now looking at the prevalence, so the presence of lactose intolerance in Finland linked to the practice of domesticating cattle for dairy purposes. And we're looking at how this particular trait is linked to this particular practice. So linking those two together. So we know that the evidence that's going to come about is going to be very much linked to Finland, very much linked to domestic cattle farming for dairy purposes, and we're going to be looking at lactose intolerance. So to understand this claim and how it fits in with our research investigation, we need to have a look at their background information. So what I'm going to do is we're going to have a quick read of their background information. So I'll pop that over here. All right, so background. Lactose is the main carbohydrate found in milk. Typically, human infants can readily digest milk in order to grow and develop due to the presence of the enzyme lactase in their intestine. The production of this enzyme typically declines in adulthood, removing a significant source of available dietary carbohydrate. Some humans continue to express lactase throughout adult life and are thus able to digest the lactose found in fresh milk. This trait is called lactase persistence, and the frequency of this phenotype is found in around 35% of adults living in the world today. According to Ward, 2009, through tracing the genetic markers of previous generations, that early Europeans, particularly from Sweden and Denmark, had the capacity to digest milk, while others from China and Africa around a similar time period appear to have had a milk intolerance. Gerbolt, 2011, supports these findings with evidence showing that a single mutation, the -13910T, can be used to explain the distribution of lactase persistence across Europe, whereas several mutations are associated with it in Africa and the Middle East. Additionally, Pagel 1999 also noted that there were 3 distinctly different groups of humans that appeared to independently demonstrate through the selection of rare alleles, lactose intolerance into adulthood, suggesting that this mutation was brought about by change in the environment of these early Europeans. Current estimates of the age of lactase persistence associated alleles appear to align with the origins of the culturally transmitted practice of dairying. Goebolt, 2011. So let's have a look at this background information here. What I've done is I've pulled it apart and I've broken down exactly what it covers. So in the background information in this first section, it talks about lactose. What is lactose? What the relationship is between lactose and humans. And that's all covered in here. It also talks about how lactose and the ability to digest it is usually declines with age in humans. And that's got to do with the lactase enzyme also declining. So everything we need to know to make sense of this research question in terms of lactose is provided in this first paragraph. The second paragraph explains how evolutionary traits can be traced to their origins. So don't forget, the other part of this claim is about evolution. And so this needs to tie the claim and the research question together in terms of, and identify the link between dairy farming. So it explains how evolutionary traits can be traced to their origins, and that in this case, that the mutation to tolerate lactose was caused by different mutations depending on your location. It makes the links between the location and dairy farming practices, and it concludes with linking how the practice of dairy farming and evolution by mutation. So let's have a quick look at a couple of these points. We talked about how lactose is completely covered in this first paragraph here. The next dot point, we talk about, we can see it here, through tracing genetic markers of previous generations that early Europeans, particularly from, so it goes into talk about specific locations and how they're able to trace back these evolutionary traits. And they also are able to compare where these traits exist in certain periods of time. So that's all covered in this situation, in this dot point here. It also talks about then in the next bit, it's talking about how certain places or certain areas seem to have tolerate lactose a lot better for a lot longer of the adult life than in others. And then it also talks about here how they're linking the practices of cattle farming in those locations to the higher numbers of people that are able to tolerate lactose. So this background information basically sets up the reader to completely understand everything that they need to in order to put their evidence in into context, or to prepare them to understand how the evidence actually links to the claim, the research question, and then ultimately the claim. So I get that this on here is quite a complex way of looking at it, or the content is quite complex. So what we're going to do is we're going to simplify it right down, and we're going to have a look at our lolly situation that we talked about last lesson. So let's have a quick recap of what we were looking at. So our lolly example says that the claim, lollies make people happy. We broke down that claim in that lesson and we turned it into a research question, and the research question was, does providing students at Chisholm Catholic College with jelly beans daily increase their productivity? Evidence by increasing their grade. So we've got our claim and we've got our lollies make people happy. It's time to have a look at the background information. So what is it that we need to know about this in order to understand how this report or this investigation is going to be relevant to both the research question and the claim? So our background information, what might we need to include? So what we might include is what jelly beans are made from, what they are, and how do they interact with the human body. So these ones here, the point that we might be getting at is we talked about this one here links productivity with jelly beans. And we know that jelly beans are primarily made from glucose, and glucose is a primary source of energy for the brain. So if this was what you were going to put in your background information, perhaps you'd do the research and you'd be explaining what jelly beans are, what they're made of, and what they do to the body that might actually result in them increasing a student's grade. So that there is very similar in this lactose and the relationship between humans and lactose paragraph that they have written. The next bit that we might look at is, what does being productive usually result in? So I've got a couple of key things indicated here. I've got the jelly beans and I've got the increased productivity and increasing their grade. So the first section will be about the jelly beans. The second section is going to target productivity. And in the third section, I'm going to talk about how they increase their grades. So what does being productive usually result in? And I've missed the L. Usually result in. What it results in is usually you can get more completed, more time which might mean more time for revision, and therefore an increased feeling of success. Now this line here typically links back into the claim, because success and happy, success will likely lead to happiness. All of these three things are all also likely to result in increasing your grade. So this information, whilst I've made it up for the purposes of this, I could likely find this from more of a psychological point of view. So things that result in happiness, or things that if I was to find a website that would tell me about how to increase productivity, I would likely find most of these reasons and consequences. So the last section then is making the link that the properties of jelly beans can be linked to bettering grades. So if I was to say, so this link that we're going to come from, in my mind, I would say that the increase, or the receiving, so the intake of glucose via jelly beans provides nourishment for the brain in order to produce greater productivity and ultimately achieve better grades. So that would be the link that I would be getting here in the background information. So my little bit of red writing here is the really quick and easy summary for you to look at. Your background information, the point of it is to provide information about the key elements in your research question and state the relationship between them. So the key elements in this lolly example are jelly beans, productivity, which then links to increased grades, and then links them all together. And that is going to set your background information up for a good chunk of success. So that's the background information. Let's have a look at the evidence section now. Okay. Just make sure that that's still in view. Okay. The evidence section, and again, I'm going to block off this other side because we're going to build that one after. All right, so the sample. Now, granted, the sample context is a little bit complicated, but don't forget we're going to use this one to dissect it, pull out what we can understand from it, and then we're going to create our own one again. So, the evidence, remember we're talking about Finland, and we're talking about lactose persistence and lactose intolerance. So here we go. In Finland, there are a variety of genealogies forming the genetic makeup of the country. The population is mainly comprised of a variety of groups of people who identify as speaking Finnish, Swedish, and Norwegian. There are also the minority, 60,000 to 110,000 individuals, indigenous people of Sapmi, a territory comprising parts of Arctic Norway, Sweden, and Finland, and Russia's Kola Peninsula, called the Sami. According to the census data, which requires people to self-identify as Sami, the Finnish population of Sami is approximately 4,500 compared to 5.496 million Finns. Statistics of Finland 2016. The minority group show differences in cultural practices and genealogy when compared to the majority Finnish demographic. In terms of practice of ancient dairying, current evidence suggests domestication of livestock in Finland and large-scale animal husbandry was occurring during the Bronze Age, 3,500 and 2,500 years ago. To further support this, analysis of core ware pottery may have revealed Neolithic settlers in Finland may have been consuming dairy foods as early as 2,500 BC. However, data from Hansen et al. 2015 states that the prevalence of lactose intolerance in Finnish-speaking Finns has been documented at 17%, whilst in the Finnish Sami population, the prevalence ranges from 25 to 60%. This is a noticeable variance in which could be explained by the access to cow's milk between the different populations. On one hand, the Sami have traditionally participated in farming, fishing, trapping, and reindeer husbandry, breeding and herding. Their ancient diet may have consisted of a high intake of fatty fish, red meat, primarily reindeer, fat, blood, and organs, wild berries, and boiled, unfiltered coffee, and low intakes of cultivated vegetables and fruit, bread, and fiber. Sahi 1994 indicates that reindeer farming, however, only developed late in the 18th century. This combined evidence would suggest that cow's milk was not a part of the Sami diet and thus would not influence the lactase persistence frequency in the gene pool. A further comparison in Table 1, comparison of average cow and reindeer milk, illustrates that lactose percentages and production rates are very different in each of the dairy sources. Thus, it could be assumed that lactase persistence would not be required to supplement nutrition in a population consuming small amounts of low lactose milk. So I'm only going to read up to here, and then I'll take you through and show you what the second piece of evidence actually looks like. But basically, this whole beginning part of the evidence has set up you to understand exactly what the percentage of this population in Finland is actually the Sami, so the indigenous population, versus the more European population. So we're looking at this one here. What they're suggesting is that the Sami, compared to the rest of the Finnish population, dealt with more reindeer than cows and cattle. And so when we look at what they've added in here is a table that shows average dairy cow, the average dairy cow and what is actually inside of its milk, and the reindeer and what's inside of its milk. So when we're looking at the lactose percentage of 5% versus the lactose percentage of 2.4% in the reindeer, you can see that it's half the amount of lactose. So low lactose milk compared to the dairy cow. Obviously, this whole pre-reading part has provided the context for this table for you to understand why it's important. So why is this relevant? Well, what they're suggesting is that the Sami, who were basically farming reindeer or keeping reindeer with them and using their milk and their meat, they were consuming low lactose milk. So therefore, being able to tolerate high levels of lactose was not actually a benefit. And so if it's not a benefit, the push for it to become a common trait or to become an evolutionary trait that's passed on is not as important. So they didn't need it. It wasn't a benefit. Whereas in the rest of the Finnish population, where they had cattle and they were relying on the nutrients that it provides, that the dairy provides, being able to digest and tolerate lactose becomes a benefit because it's going to be able to nourish the people. So that's why this table here is relevant. I will quickly read you the rest of it actually, because there's not too much. So it goes on. Genetic information further supports this assumption. Table 2, lactase persistence, associated allele frequencies in populations of Finland show the prevalence of the -13910T allele is higher in the population of Finns compared to the Sami. It should be noted that none of the other multiple alleles associated with lactase persistence are shown in either of the population. So it's a very specific allele that exists in the Finnish population. Here is the diagram, and I apologize for the fact that it's very small, but I'll show you and highlight the key differences. So the population is split into the Finns and the Sami. If we go across, we're looking at the predicted lactase persistence frequency. In Finns, the predicted lactase persistence meaning that tolerated, is 0.82, while in the Sami it's as low as 0.31. So they're saying that it is true that the Sami have a lesser ability to tolerate lactose, while the Finns have a much higher ability to tolerate lactose. The Finns are the ones that have been farming dairy cattle for a very long period of time, whereas the Sami have traditionally farmed or kept reindeer and drunk their milk. So low lactose milk, low ability to digest lactose, higher lactose milk, higher ability to digest lactose. Okay, so that is the sample side of things. Let's have a look and let's start building our own one. Oh, actually, before we go through that, let's quickly go through the dot points here. So the sample, what does it actually do in this part of the write-up? And I'll make that page white. It provides relevant context to the data that you have found as evidence. So you have to provide the context to the data that is your evidence. It does this by, firstly, identifying the different genetic groups of Finland and their current populations, and it describes their farming practices, particularly referring to dairy farming, and then it links the farming practice to lactose intolerance. So that was found in that first part. In the first part of there we go. This part here, the very beginning bit, talked about the population and their numbers. The second part over here talked about the farming practices of the population, and then the third part talked about the diets of the population that were here. And then we went on to talk about how the linking the diets to the tolerance of lactose. The next bit is it prepares the reader to interpret the data set by linking the data to the research question. So you need to provide a justification as to why the Sami did not need to be lactose tolerant. So that bit there is also found inside here. So those two bits are very much linked together. It also prepares the reader, so from this bit onwards, so that's when we can interpret this table and understand why it's valuable evidence, because it's the first piece of evidence that supports a line of thought, which is your research question. So each time we have a piece of evidence, we prepare the reader to interpret it, and we link the research question to it, so why it's valuable. So basically you need to go on to describe and explain the data that is given. All right, time to build our own one. So we were talking about the lolly example. We had our claim that lollies make people happy. We have our research question that is, does providing students at Chisholm Catholic College with jelly beans daily increase their productivity as evidenced by the increase in their grades? And so now we're going to recall exactly what the data was that we used in our first video. So the data we used in our first video was this data, where we had a graph that had been done up by a teacher who had done this experiment, where the percentage grade of students at Chisholm Catholic College, grade change, of students at Chisholm Catholic College when given at lollies daily. So we noted that boys for that term that were given lollies daily, their grades increased by 6%, while girls' grades increased by about 1%. From that term. I also gave you a slight little bit of context with this when I spoke to you last time and said that the teacher had done this experiment where in term 1 she didn't give them any lollies, and she examines them at the end of the term. And then in term 2, she gave them a jelly bean daily, or so however many jelly beans daily, and examined them again at the end of the term, and then compared the two. So using that in mind, what is it that you would include in this part here as context for them? What you would include is Chisholm is a secondary high school, so that's possibly important to the way in which the body breaks down jelly beans, or how quickly it's available, the glucose is available to the student. So Chisholm is a secondary high school. The students of both classes, if she'd done this across 2, I can't remember what I said. The students of classes were in grade 8, so we have an age. We can understand exactly what is part of their life at that point in time. In grade 8, in the subject area of science, the assessment task was an exam, and the percentage grade change was calculated by comparing the grade from the previous term with the term where lollies were given each day. I forgot to put this dot point in, so we'll come over here. The data shows that student grades did increase. So this is where we're going to talk about exactly what data actually shows. So the data shows that student grades did increase when students received jelly beans daily. And then we're going to make that link between the data and the research question. So increase in student grades is evidence of greater productivity because the students had more time to revise and rehearse. So that link is what ties it all back to the research question. So our little bit of red writing here that summarizes what your evidence needs to include. You need to provide context in which the data was collected. You need to explain what the data shows, and then you need to link the findings to the research question. I hope that was helpful. All of these resources are available for you on your OneNote. So good luck.